Hello, everyone. I hope it's been an interesting day for you so far, and there's been lots of insights you can take away and think about. Um, First of all, I'd just like to apologise for the absolutely ridiculous placement of the camera on my laptop screen, which is the bottom left-hand corner. Hence, why you've sort of got a staring up at me angle for this. But hopefully, that won't detract too much from the findings. Just to briefly introduce myself, my name is Berka. I've been a market research manager here at QS for 3 years, where my primary responsibility is to run the International Student Survey, which some of you may have heard about, some of you might not. Don't worry, I'll take you through a bit of the background to the survey in a bit. But my main responsibility is to manage all the outputs that we generate from that, all of the reports that we produce. And I believe in the goodie bags that you'll be taking away from this, that there'll be a report from the ISS there, so you can flick through it and see what the survey is all about in the main. So whilst I'm going through the results from the survey today, I'll focus specifically on peer-to-peer interactions and how they impact student decision-making. The survey itself focuses on a much wider range of issues in relation to their decisions. It looks at all of their different priorities, all of the influences that take place there, the importance of graduate outcomes, how they define teaching quality, their social media use, a whole range of issues. So I would really encourage you to download those reports and see what the survey is about. Just to give you a brief outline of the presentation today, I'll start by giving you a quick overview of the survey itself, just to provide some context for how we set it up in the first place and the methodology that we use to collect the data. I'll then move on to a summary of how prospective students make decisions about their studies abroad and focus on, what are the things which are really important to them. I'll then move on to their biggest concerns that prospective students have before moving abroad to study and the barriers that might prevent them from studying overseas. And we'll follow up on that by looking at how universities can help to alleviate some of these concerns, and in particular look at the potential for student-to-student interactions to help in achieving this. What I'll then do is we'll look at some of the information collecting habits of prospective students more broadly, but again, we'll focus on the role that your current international students can play a part in this and the role that they have. And I'll finish by just taking you some of the results of another survey that we've been running separate to the International Student Survey. And that's all around the impressions of current and prospective international students towards the coronavirus and how it's impacted their studies or even their plans to study overseas. And again, we'll pivot that to look at how current international students can help to inform prospective students to help them in their decision making. So just a bit of background to the survey then, because it's been running in its current format, if you like, since 2013. And since then, it's grown year on year to become the world's largest survey of pre-enrolled international students. I think it's important there to talk about the audience here. It's very much pre-enrolled students. So that's any inquirers or applicants to universities who are looking to study overseas and still very much in that decision-making phase of applying to go to university. 2020 was our largest ever survey. We had something approaching 80,000 responses, which is a fantastic, huge database that we can cut in all kinds of ways to try and ensure we're looking at the most relevant audience. In terms of how we gather those 80,000 responses, we partner with universities from all over the world, in the UK, in Australia, in Northern America, and we rely on those universities to send out the survey to their inquirers and applicants. And as a thank you to each institution that takes part, we send them a benchmarking report, which will contain the results from their own international inquirers and applicants, and we compare that to a benchmark. So they can see what defines their own prospective student audience and how they can then tailor their recruitment strategies to suit this. And just a note there, we do also weight the data according to a respondent's nationality. This is just to ensure that the data that we're looking at is representative of the global population of international students. And it's very much just to provide an additional layer of reliability to the data. As I said, you'll be getting a report in your virtual goodie bags, but if you want, you can download a copy of the latest reports at the website there. If you go to internationalstudentsurvey.com, you can download all the reports that you want to there. And if you're from a university and you're interested in having your institution take part, then you can also register your interest there as well. And I'll get an automated email and I'll follow up with you there as well. So before we get into the real detail of peer-to-peer interactions and discussions, I just wanted to give a very broad overview of the most important elements that feature in the decision-making process for prospective students, because this is very much the core part of the survey and the main reason we established the survey in the first place. And we did this because we want to understand the way that prospective students make decisions. So very much how they make them, and understand what are the issues which are important to them and how they define the decisions that they make. And the way we do this is that in the survey, we split out the decision-making process into 3 stages, 3 things that they might have to make a final decision on. That's a course, deciding on a country, and deciding on a university. And for each of these, we show respondents a long list of options that they might potentially see as being important in their decision-making. We then ask them to pick their top 5, and once they've done that and they've picked their top 5, we ask them to rank their top 5 based on their order of importance. And this gives us a huge amount of quite granular detail on their decision making, and we can really drill down into the data. What I'll show you on the next slide is basically just an overview of the most important priorities at each stage of the funnel. So you can see here, when it comes to choosing a course, the most important thing is, rather unsurprisingly, that they have a personal interest in the subject. Again, it's not surprising, but I think it is worth reiterating that they expect this interest to be nurtured and to develop whilst they're at university, and for the people around them to exhibit that same passion for the subject matter and with their teachers and their lecturers, but also that they'll be studying with like-minded individuals, and they want to, be immersed in that subject, and for the people around them to be as interested in the subject as they are. That it leads to their chosen career is the second most important factor. Again, I think that's not particularly surprising, because we know that career considerations will be very top of mind, particularly for international students, and they'll want to know that they're on the right career path. But what's interesting, I think, is that these considerations are taking place right at the very start of the decision-making process. So for many of our responses, this is even before they've applied to go to university, and they're already thinking about their future career and their time after university. And I think universities need to really bear this in mind when they're communicating with their prospects, and it needs to be reflected in course prospectuses and marketing materials, and the importance of graduate outcomes really needs to be reflected when they're communicating with their prospects. And lastly the importance of a high quality teaching environment when they're studying for their course. And this is something which we'll go on to see as a pretty consistent priority throughout the decision-making process. So I'll just bring up the other 2 stages there, priorities when choosing a country and a university, just because when you think about these 2 factors, it all boils down to a couple of key things. So first and foremost, it's that international students want to make sure they're able to study in a place which is safe and welcoming to them. There are various ways of ensuring this. I think at a countrywide level, it's often some of the more socioeconomic factors that come into play. So being able to portray a very multicultural and diverse society is often a very intangible but effective way of proving that you're welcoming to international students and the international sector. Often it's these very less tangible elements which work quite well. So if you think about the option for international students to be able to work whilst they're studying, the presence of post-study work rights are both elements which can demonstrate a willingness and a welcoming environment for international students. I think at a university level, it's just important to communicate your commitments and any initiatives which focus on student safety, which will demonstrate how you're able to support international students, which are important. I think it's also worth noting at this point that when you think about the people who influence prospective students the most, for a lot of them, that's their parents. And we know from other research that we've done is the thing which parents worry most about when their children go abroad to study is student safety. So especially when you're thinking about student halls and where students live, any initiatives which make them safer should be communicated not just to the students, but also to their parents if possible. This is going to reassure them about some of their biggest concerns, which in turn will help you recruit more international students. Again, it's also worth mentioning the importance of high quality teaching, which you can see is a pretty consistent priority throughout the decision-making process. It emerges at every single stage. And I think it's something that students will really think about continually as they go through it. They'll always be on the lookout for indicators of good teaching quality. And I think they'll obviously be looking for markers, anything that might demonstrate that. And I think rankings will inevitably play a role here. They'll be comparing different countries in global rankings of universities, look at how a country performs overall to give an indication at a national level, but they'll also be looking at things at a university level. So the importance of high quality teaching ties in very much with a university's reputation and the individual ranking score for many of them, purely because it's such an easily understandable sort of distilled figure, which offers an indication about so many different aspects of a university. That is for some of them. For others, high quality teaching will mean different things. So for some, it's very much around the teaching staff and the people who will actually be teaching them. For others, it's the equipment and the study facilities that they have, and that will obviously depend very much on the course that they study. So whether that's sort of a science-related degree or a STEM-related subject or a humanities and social sciences, it will mean different things to different people. And there's a couple of other sort of less prominent things there. So the importance of the culture and the lifestyle appealing to them when they're thinking about what country to study in. That's a very important aspect. And this is something that we'll look at in great detail later on, because we'll see it's quite an obvious concern of students that where they study is the right cultural fit for them. They'll want to be reassured that where they study means they won't be isolated culturally, and that they'll be welcomed where they live. So it's important to highlight these themes, I think, in the marketing materials and when communicating with the prospects, because it's definitely something that they'll be on the lookout for. And lastly there, the availability of scholarships when choosing a university. Obviously, this isn't something which is going to be applicable to all of your international students, but often the mere presence of scholarships and the option to receive one can be a crucial factor for many international applicants. Even if they don't go on to qualify for one, often their mere presence helps to convey a willingness to support international students in more general terms. And I think it's worth communicating that any messages about scholarships are best communicated at the start of that inquiry process, because once they have applied and come down to their final decisions, their funding options are more fixed and they're less likely to have to rely on a scholarship. So their importance to the individual student will decline as they actually progress through that decision-making process from their initial inquiry through to accepting their final offer. But yeah, taken as a whole, you can see that student decision-making boils down to a few key factors. It's all about being able to prove you can provide a safe and welcoming location, ensuring a good reputation from an institution, and the ability to provide high quality teaching. But there are definitely some secondary factors there in the ways of value considerations, future career considerations, and obviously ensuring that the interest in their subject matter is enhanced as they go through. So that's just in a nutshell, student decision making. I'll move on to look at sort of pre-arrival concerns. So this is very much what are prospective students most worried about? What are the barriers that will stop them from being able to study abroad? And it can be helpful to look at what worries them the most, because as a university, because then you know how best to alleviate these worries, and in turn that can lead to better conversion. As we'll go on to see, current international students can be crucial in helping to ease some of the concerns from prospective students, purely because they've been through the same process, and they can then reassure their prospects in ways which they wouldn't necessarily get from talking directly to a university. And they can advise them in slightly different ways. So what we did is we asked respondents what were the things which worried them the most about studying abroad. And as we'll go on to see, the main concerns fit into three broad categories. Now, principally, that's concerns about the financial viability of studying overseas. So that's the most widespread concern is the cost of living. You can see there, and I think that again that's relatively unsurprising, given that most of the countries with well-established higher education sectors, like the UK, like Australia, like the US and Canada, have comparably high costs of living compared to countries with large numbers of outbound international students. So it makes sense to see this as a prominent concern. I think from a university's perspective, all this means is that any additional support for international students should be communicated. And I think it's important to give them an accurate picture of the kind of lifestyle they can expect, because when it's done well, it can help to alleviate some of their biggest concerns about studying abroad. You can see there some of the other financial related worries about the availability of scholarships. So we've seen that's already seen that's an important factor when when choosing a university. So it makes sense to see it emerge as a concern here. And also getting a job as well. And I think this applies just as much to finding a job during their studies to help support and sustain them when they're studying, but also finding a job after they've graduated as well. Again, I think any assistance towards helping students find employment and any measures which will remove any restrictions on them being able to work during their studies are going to resonate very well with your prospective international students. Another prominent theme to emerge in the way of their biggest concerns is around student safety. So we've already seen the importance of providing a safe and welcoming destination for your international students. And you can see there that safety and being made to feel unwelcome and being culturally isolated are some of the biggest concerns of prospective students. And most of the respondents in our survey highlighted at least one of these issues of this question. So it's clear it's a big concern for them. We've seen the importance of studying somewhere which is safe and welcoming to international students when deciding where to study. So any measures which will help to provide additional security for students should be well communicated and should be made aware of. And I think, as we'll go on to see, this is definitely something where connecting prospectives and current international students can really help to alleviate some of these concerns, purely because the experiences of current students when they're being made to feel welcome or unwelcome, and how they're able to convey those experiences to prospective students are what will carry the most weight for your prospects when they come to choose between universities or even choose between different countries that they want to study in. But we'll go on to that in a bit. But I think it's really important that universities are able to invest in these measures to make students feel safe and to support them accordingly whenever they have experiences which make them feel unwelcomed, because they'll be well received. They'll help to enhance the university's reputation in the long term. The last sort of pre-arrival concern that we just want to briefly mention here is that of accommodation. It's just worth mentioning that a lot of students have worries over accommodation. I think given recent events and press coverage around that particular topic, it's not really a surprise to see that this features so highly as something that they're worried about. But it is worth also mentioning this is something which consistently emerges as a concern for this audience. And it's not solely driven by recent events. It's something which is a long-standing concern for a lot of them. So obviously, any information about student accommodation is something which prospective students expect to see when they're communicating with universities. So I think it's important that universities are well equipped to be able to say what's available for their international student cohorts. And it all links back to providing an accurate picture of the kind of lifestyle they can expect when they move overseas to study. So that's a very brief overview of the main concerns that prospective students have. Obviously, the next step is, what can universities do to help try and alleviate some of these? It's important for them to do this because not only because it enables them to develop a comprehensive knowledge of what they're worried about, but also how to help ease the pressures of these concerns. In doing so, you can demonstrate an empathetic understanding of the mindset of prospective students, which in turn will make it easier for you to manage them along that inquiry and application process, which in turn will lead to greater numbers of international enrollments. So when we asked respondents what would make them feel less worried about studying abroad, one of the principal methods for doing this relates to the daunting prospect for many international students of finding themselves in an entirely new country with no knowledge of their immediate environment. I think this lack of knowledge about their environment, about the culture they're living in, does cause quite significant concern to prospective students. And therefore, universities should be endeavoring to provide information not only about the culture, but also the lifestyle they can expect when they're studying overseas. And that will really help to alleviate some of these concerns. Another important factor for universities to consider relates to the importance of close personal networks in student decision making. So in previous iterations of our reports, we've highlighted that 2/3 of prospective international students either know someone who is currently studying abroad or know someone who has previously studied abroad. So for many, having friends or family in the country they're looking to study in can be the deciding factor when they're choosing where to go. I think crucially, if prospective students are able to hear from their close personal networks that there is good support for international students at a particular institution, then they are more likely to be reassured about that institution's ability to help them and to help their international student populations. So if you're an institution, proving your credentials in this area can be tricky, but I think it will pay off in the long term, because then you start to bring in the benefits of international alumni networks, and they have the potential to be very effective ambassadors when speaking about their own experiences, especially when it comes to support that they've received. And finally, I think it's just important to highlight the ability for prospective students to ask questions of existing international students at that institution. Again, I think that's very important, considering this is a Unibuddy conference and the importance of providing platforms like that. But it just reiterates that it's important for universities to find ways to connect prospective and current international students, as that peer-to-peer knowledge sharing is likely to carry a lot more weight in the minds of prospective students than anything they might hear via official channels through the university. Because we think that most of the interactions between these two groups will relate back to their key concerns on whether they feel safe on campus and how well the university has supported them during that enrollment process. So you can see how these interactions can shape the decision-making process for prospective students on the issues which really matter to them, namely being able to choose a country and a university which welcomes them as an international student. So again, just lastly on this pre-arrival concern, we wanted to understand how to better communicate to prospective international students. And we started with this by looking at what are the topics that they really want to receive information about. So within the survey, what we did is we showed respondents a long list of potential topics and asked them which ones they would most want to hear about from universities. So we've just shown the top 6 here. So I didn't want to show you everything, but these are the 6 most popular topics that they'd want to hear about. So starting in the top right, most popular one was information about teaching staff. We know that this is an important indicator of teaching quality. We know that from previous reports that we've done. So it's likely that prospective students will be doing their own research on teachers and lecturers anyway. So if universities can help with this by providing them with this information, then it will be well received. And we also know from previous years of running the survey that what they look for in a lecturer is passion for the subject matter and any real world experience sort of outside that world of academia. The second most popular topic there is the ability to ask questions of current students. Again, we see the importance of these kinds of interactions between these two groups, especially when it comes to prospective student decision making. I think not only in this context, not only are current students seen as being able to provide a more trustworthy and a valued judgment of an institution, but as we've just seen, they can also help to allay some of their concerns about studying overseas. So again, providing any platforms to directly link up these two audiences will be very well received by prospective students. Thirdly, there we can see accommodation information. We've already seen that most of our prospective students will have concerns over finding suitable accommodation. So it makes sense to see the demand for this in university communications. But again, any information about this will be well received and will help to alleviate some of the concerns that they have around this. Fourth one there is practical tips to help with their application. It's clear this is something that prospective students always feel that they need help with. So any assistance here, I think, is going to resonate really well. Fifthly there, information on work placements and links to industry. Again, we've already seen how career considerations are a big factor in their decision making. So I think it makes sense to see this emerge as a popular topic here. I think all it means is that career planning departments within universities need to be able to demonstrate that they are able to adequately support their students in this regard, just to convince prospects that the university is able to help them in a very tangible and meaningful way Obviously, any work placements as part of your courses should be clearly communicated, as they can be a really big draw for this. It's important to bear in mind they will look for easily understandable and digestible numbers to gauge work placements and links to industry and how seriously they take that. So the graduate employment rate will be the primary way that they do this. So obviously make sure it's communicated clearly where appropriate. And lastly, there are stories about current and former international students. I think this relates back to the desire to connect with current students. So it's clear that they want to hear about the experiences of current students, and that will help to inform their decision making. But obviously they can do that in a real-time situation, a real-time platform, that's going to be the most value to them. But certainly being able to read about the stories and experiences of former international students is also going to be a very valued topic. So the question remains of how they find that information that's going to help them make these decisions. And I think very broadly, just to start off, the way in which prospective students gather and filter information when researching different universities has obviously shifted very dramatically in recent years. The array of information sources available to them has increased exponentially, which means they can, in theory, make better and more informed choices than ever before. I think when you couple that with the rise of social media, it's led to instant communication, and that's produced a fundamentally different landscape for how individuals communicate with each other, which is obviously all great for prospective students. It means they're obviously very informed, but it also means there's a lot of relatively misleading information out there. So whilst prospects can research and answer themselves, it's more important than ever that they have access to trusted information sources or trusted individuals to help inform their decision making. So to kick off, what we asked respondents is, when they were finding information, how do they prefer to do that in very broad terms? We've already seen how prospective students really value the ability to connect with current students in order to ask questions of them and hear of their experiences while studying abroad. And I think that's reiterated here in the responses to this question, because you can see that just over half said they prefer to find out information by talking to an expert rather than doing their own research. And these experts could be anyone. We left it up to the respondent to interpret that, but it could be advisors at their current school or university. It could be their teachers. It could be a student ambassador. It could be any individual, really. And you can see that 43% just prefer to go online and research the answer themselves. So you can see there's actually quite an even split in the two groups. And you can see that prospects are quite divided on the best way, or the preferred way even, to find the answer to their questions. So anything which is able to credibly point them in the right direction will be well received, I think. I think what's really interesting is when you take the results of these questions and look at others, depending on what they prefer to use to find the answer to their questions, that will then impact which information sources they use to help them in their decision making. So when we asked respondents what they prefer to use, what information sources rather they find most useful, those who prefer to speak to experts on the previous slide, they are more likely to find speaking to a range of individuals to be more helpful. So you can see that this could be anyone. It could be admission staff, it could be university representatives in general, it could be education agents, university alumni, or even their close personal networks, such as family and friends. And you can see very much when you look at the information sources they prefer to use, it's very much geared towards finding answers on a one-to-one basis, and then finding the individuals who they really trust, whose opinions they will value very highly. And by contrast, for those who prefer to find the information themselves, they're more likely to do their research online, whether that's through the official university websites or more general online searches, or even social media channels for some of the more informal topics that they might want information on. So you can see there's a range of information sources there that students can use, and that depending on their individual preferences, they'll be more likely to use different types of information sources to find their answers, which I think means that it's important for universities to be able to reach their prospects in a variety of tactics, in the hopes that that will mean they can reach as broad an audience as possible. But if we just take one side of this and we look at those who are preferring to speak to an expert or prefer to speak to people, we can take that one step further and look at which individuals they're speaking to for which types of information. So what we did here is we presented respondents with a list of potential things that they might want to find information about, from friendliness to international students, to housing and accommodation, to application information, to information about fees and scholarships, and asked them, which would you prefer to speak to? A member of university staff or a current student? And you can see that the results really differ depending on the subject in question. So the vast majority would prefer to speak to a student about friendliness to international students and cultural events, and to a lesser extent, housing and accommodation. By and large, the majority still prefer to speak to university staff for the more technical and procedural queries like application information, course information, and support services. But I think what's really interesting here is that the things they want to speak to students about, in the way of friendliness to international students and social events, they closely relate to what's important to them and the concerns that they have about studying abroad. When you think about the importance of a safe and welcoming destination and the concerns they have about student safety, this ties in very much with that, you know, the things that will really convince them that they're making the right decision are when they get to speak to current international students. So you can see that overall it's a very complementary role for current students and university staff. You can see that there are quite clear and distinct areas where peer-to-peer engagements are going to take place, and also areas where they'll be more likely to go to university staff members. I think that whilst these are the overall trends that we're seeing, but it's also important to acknowledge that there are variations within the data depending on which subgroups you're looking at. So one of the principal trends that we generally saw is that the younger the prospect, the more likely they are just to go to current students for any kind of information, whether that's friendliness to international students, whether that's course information, whether that's fees and scholarships or support services. They're always more likely to go to current students. That's just the way that they prefer to find information. That's the trusted information route for them. For your older prospects, they're just more likely to go to university staff, and that's what they see as being a more reliable information source. There are also variations according to household income brackets. So generally speaking, those from households earning more than $100,000 are more likely to speak to current students, but only for those aspects which relate to the social side of things and friendliness to international students. So you can see that that's really something which is important to that higher earning bracket of prospective international students. And lastly, there are also some regional variations as well. So those prospects from North America and Western Europe, they're more likely to want to speak to students, but only for those cultural and social aspects as well. So friendliness to international students is included as part of that. Whereas those from Asia Pacific are more likely to, than other regions, to want to speak to students about some of the more formal elements, like course and application information. So you can see there's a real sort of variation and a real spread of preferences depending on which subgroup you're talking to. So you can see that demand for peer-to-peer engagement on platforms like Unibuddy actually needs to serve a number of different purposes, and that different groups of prospects will be using it for different reasons. So I just think it's important to be able to fully engage with the platforms like that, just to realize their true benefits, because they have to serve so many different purposes. And I'll wrap up just by looking at one measure, just because it sums up the influence of student recommendations quite nicely. So what we asked respondents is how likely would you be to accept an offer to study based on a recommendation from a current student? And you can see that nearly everyone is willing to take the recommendation of a current student or a student ambassador, with a third of those respondents very likely to accept a recommendation. So it's a good reflection of the kinds of value that they can provide. I think in today's day and age, where It can be difficult to find the right information amongst the multitude of sources out there and available to prospective students. Recommendations from their peers will always carry far more weight than anything which might be communicated from a university or the institution itself. So by providing channels which are able to link up current and prospective students, making that process easier, it can have a dramatic impact on student recruitment cycles. So the last section, I'll just finish up with a brief note on the coronavirus, because I'm very aware it's very much the elephant in the room at this point. I'm sure you've all attended, enough webinars and enough online talks about the coronavirus and its impact on student decision making. I will just mention that obviously all the results you've seen up to this point, that's based on the ISS results, and we conducted fieldwork for that predominantly at the very start of this year. So kind of January to February to March time is when we gathered most of the responses. So by the time we'd published the reports in April, May time, the full impact of the virus on society and the higher education sector specifically was and still is unfolding. So in addition to the International Student Survey, we've been conducting additional research into the impact of the coronavirus on student recruitment and prospective student decision making on an ongoing basis. And we've already published a series of reports on this, and we intend to publish more throughout the remainder of the year and into 2021 as well. So if you want to access any of these reports, please just go to the QS website. There's a very clearly marked section dedicated to all of the reports and white papers and blogs that we've produced. And all of these have drawn on data from another survey we've set up, which was to establish the views of students specifically on the coronavirus. Now, this survey has run continually and it's still open to responses. And it very much looks into the impact of COVID-19 on student recruitment and student demand. For the most part, it's exactly the same audience as our international student survey, which is namely prospective international students. And since we launched it in mid-February time, we've been able to gather the views of over 75,000 responses, so similar in size to the ISS. But we've been able to gauge their responses to the crisis just to get an idea of how it might impact international student flows in the future. But crucially, however, we can also demonstrate how these views have shifted over the course of 2020 as the crisis unfolds. And in the last couple of months, what we've done is we've also included current international students in the survey, so we can ask them specific questions around their experiences of studying at university and their life on campus, or not for some of them, as the case may be. But we'll focus on the results of these questions, as we believe these are the elements which we think will come up in conversations between prospective and current international students, and they'll revolve very much on simply what is it like to be on campus at the minute as an international student. So one of the first questions that we asked current international students in September is, what have you had to do after arriving in the country? Assuming that is that they have arrived in the country to study overseas. And you can see that for most of them, what they're doing is very much what you'd expect. They're limiting any visitors to the place where they live, and they're living within their own bubble, so they're socially isolating. Most are also doing their studies online. And obviously this depends very much on the university, but also the course and the subject that they're studying. From our research, we know that just over half are doing all of their classes online, and pretty much everyone left over is engaged in some form of hybrid teaching, which incorporates both online lectures and also face-to-face elements where obviously it's safe to do so and all the safeguards are in place. Many are simply avoiding sort of public areas, which includes university campuses altogether, and they're not really exploring the wider place where they live. Slightly fewer are just self-isolating and avoiding contact with people outside their own social bubble. So it's very much, paints a picture of what you'd expect for international students. When we asked them, what have the universities been doing to help you in this? Again, this is just to get an impression of what campus life is like, if it's open at all for different universities. But again, I think the results very much coincide with what we'd expect. So most universities are just making classes all available online so that students don't miss anything. And outside of that, it's the most widely adopted tactics, which is what we're seeing in countries and places all over the world, which is namely making face coverings mandatory, ensuring a healthy supply of hand gel in all the communal areas. And for most, it's just all about being seen to take student safety seriously. And I think for the university, communicating that it's doing everything it can to ensure student life can return to normal is what's going to be most important. And communicating that message is important because it will filter down to the students, and then it will filter down through to prospective students as well. And lastly, we asked international students how well supported do you feel by your university throughout this pandemic. And you can see the results there. I think what's interesting about this is that they're pretty evenly distributed. There's sort of a fifth who feel they've been very well supported, and then there's also a significant minority who feel not well supported at all. So I think it's there's a lot of variation in how different universities have supported their students and the different strategies that they've adopted. When you ask respondents, why do you feel this way? So why do you feel well supported, or why don't you feel well supported by contrast? For those who think positively of their university, it's all down to the support they've received in the way of food parcels, and surprisingly, but also offering academic and personal support, which also relates to, supporting their mental health, recognizing that this will take a toll on international students and adapting accordingly. I think on an academic side, it's also all about converting classes to an online format, but doing that effectively, and also ensuring that wherever classes can take place in person, they open up campus buildings, but with all the necessary safeguards. So it's obviously it's clear that students prefer socially distanced face-to-face lectures as opposed to an online lecture. So those universities which feel they are able to open up campus in a safe way will very much feel the benefit of that. By contrast, for those who are perhaps slightly less positive, it's all about the inaccurate or slow dissemination of information. So one person there complained about everyone being directed to one department, which then gets inundated with requests and is really slow to answer everyone. And for others, it's more about the fact that campus isn't open at all, which can then have a detrimental impact on the perceptions of that university. So just to leave you with a couple of brief key takeaways then, there's a number of factors that are important in prospective student decision-making. It's important to prove a welcoming destination, high quality teaching, and to reflect the importance of graduate outcomes. When it comes to the concerns that prospective students have, they revolve around three core themes: financial aspects, student safety, and finding the right accommodation are the biggest ones. But it's also important to acknowledge that peer-to-peer engagements can really help with that, particularly around aspects of student safety. And in the age of the coronavirus, the things which will really help to prove that a university is taking this seriously and is supporting its students, it comes down to the availability of food parcels, one-to-one support, both academically and from a more empathetic point of view with regards to their mental health, but also ensuring an engaging online experience are what will drive the positive impressions of universities. So what I'll do, I'll just leave you with, you can go to our company page or you can tweet us. I've left my email address there. So if you have any questions about the survey or any data that we might gather, please do feel free to get in touch directly. And I've also left the International Student Survey website up there because I really would encourage you to go there and download the reports because there's a whole range of information that we haven't had a chance to cover today, but which we do cover in the reports.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing that data. I think the team was loving the data. I saw them kind of popping up on the live stream, commenting on that. So yeah, would you mind if I asked you one quick question from our audience before you
Sure.
Fab. So I was just wondering, we've got a question from Ed, and he said, interesting stuff about decision-making priorities. And he was wondering how much of a factor leads to my chosen career is, do you think, for arts and humanities students? Do you think that personal interest might be more significant depending on what type of course that they select?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot of things to consider here. I think for international students, the biggest subjects they'll be interested in are business and management and engineering, both of which are subjects which have a heavy focus on future careers and graduate outcomes. So I think it very much depends on a number of things. It does depend on which subjects and course they're interested in studying in. A lot of them depend on their source country and what they're looking to do after they graduate. Are they looking to remain in the country they study in? Are they looking to return home? So yeah, I think it very much depends on a number of different factors. This was just a very broad overview of the most important priorities, which will inevitably be skewed by the most popular subjects for international students, which is business and engineering.